This is Rex Heuermann. For 30 years, he was a Manhattan architect, a husband, a father, a neighbor. Nobody looked at twice. He was also the Gilgo Beach killer, one of the most prolific serial murderers in American history, responsible for at least 8 deaths across 3 decades on Long Island. On April 8, 2026, he stood in a courtroom and admitted to all of it. 7 murders by guilty plea. An 8th he confessed to without even being charged. He didn't look back at the families in the gallery. He didn't cry. 2 months later, a judge sentenced him to life in prison without any possibility of parole. That's where the story ends. This is where it begins. Rex Andrew Heuermann was born on September 13, 1963, in the same house he'd later be arrested in. His father, Theodore, was an aerospace engineer, a man who built satellites for a living and built furniture in his spare time in a workshop attached to the house. His mother, Dolores, was the one the neighbors remembered. Controlling, some called her. Close to Rex in a way that felt unusual, even to people who barely knew the family. Then, when Rex was 12 years old, his father died. He was 50. After that, it was just Rex, his brother, and Dolores. In that house, in that basement workshop his father left behind. The same one Rex would later inherit, and later fill with something else entirely. He wasn't a standout in school. A former classmate remembered him getting picked on. He graduated Berner High School in 1981, one class behind a kid named Billy Baldwin, who'd go on to become a movie star while Rex went on to study architecture at the New York Institute of Technology. By 1987, he was working in Manhattan. By 1994, he had his own firm, R.H. Consultants and Associates, with real clients. American Airlines, Catholic Charities, city sewer projects. He bought his mother's house that same year for $170,000 and moved in with his growing family. 2 marriages, a stepson, a daughter, Victoria, born in 1996, who'd eventually go to work at her father's own firm. On paper, it was a life, a mortgage, a commute, a little league game on Saturday. Prosecutors say the killing had already started before any of that. The earliest charge against him goes back to November of 1993. A woman named Sandra Costilla, 28 years old, from Trinidad and Tobago, living in New York City. Hunters found her body in the woods, 60 miles from Gilgo Beach. It would take 31 years for anyone to connect her death to Rex Heuermann. For over a decade after that, nothing, or nothing anyone could see. Then, in 2007, a woman named Maureen Brainerd Barnes traveled from Connecticut to New York City. She told a friend she'd spend the day in Manhattan. She was 25. She never came home. In 2009 and 2010, 3 more women vanished the same way. Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, all in their 20s, all working as escorts, advertising online, all last seen getting into a car with a client, or checking into a motel, or walking out a door that never opened again. They'd become known as the Gilgo Four. Here's the detail that mattered most to investigators, and the one that says the most about how he chose them. Every one of these women was small, under 5 feet tall in some cases, under 100 pounds. Women who worked alone, advertised alone, and could disappear for days before anyone thought to look for them. That wasn't an accident. That was a selection. In May of 2010, a woman named Shannon Gilbert called 911 from a street in Oak Beach, saying someone was after her. She vanished before police arrived. Her disappearance is what triggered the search that found everyone else. Though to this day, her own death has never been conclusively tied to Heuermann. In December of 2010, searchers found the remains of Barthelemy, Waterman, Costello, and Brainerd Barnes, the Gilgo Four, scattered across a half-mile stretch near Ocean Parkway, wrapped in burlap. By the following spring, the count had climbed past 10. A woman named Jessica Taylor, found years earlier by someone walking her dog. Her remains now linked to the same stretch of coastline. A woman named Valerie Mack, a woman whose tattoo earned her the nickname Peaches, found inside a plastic container years before anyone realized what it meant. Her toddler daughter, found later, a few miles away. An unidentified man dressed in women's clothing. A body that would take 27 years to get a name. Karen Vergata. Some of these victims still don't have names attached to their killer. Some of the dead on that stretch of highway may never be tied to anyone at all. For over a decade, the case went cold. The killer kept living 15 miles away, kept going to work, kept building his firm. Investigators believe he used burner phones to contact victims and set up meetings, then discarded the phones. He used a fake email account to search for escorts and, according to court filings, for violent pornography. He drove a dark-colored pickup truck, the kind a witness once described seeing near a disappearance in 2010. Nobody connected it to him, not for 12 more years. The break came quietly. In 2022, investigators ran vehicle registration records against witness descriptions of that truck and got a name, Rex Heuermann. From there, they pulled cell phone data and found his device had been active near several victims right before they vanished. They found his internet searches, including, investigators say, searches about the Gilgo Beach case itself. They didn't move, not yet. They wanted him to think nothing had changed. So they watched, and they waited for him to slip. In the summer of 2023, a surveillance team followed him through Manhattan and watched him throw out a half-eaten box of pizza. They retrieved it from the trash. The crust carried his DNA. That DNA matched a male hair recovered from the burlap wrapped around Megan Waterman's body. A piece of evidence that had been sitting in an evidence locker for over a decade, waiting for a name. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested outside his office in Manhattan. He was 59 years old. When police searched his home, they found more than 200 firearms in a hidden vault, a large doll encased in glass, a portrait of a woman with a bruise painted on her face. They brought in an excavator and tore up his yard, looking for more. His wife of nearly 30 years, Asa Ellerup, filed for divorce almost immediately. She and their children had been out of town for many of the disappearances, visiting family in Iceland or in Maryland, which prosecutors say gave him the windows he needed. For nearly 3 years, Heuermann denied everything. His lawyers fought the DNA evidence in court. A trial was scheduled for September of 2026. It never happened. On April 8, 2026, Rex Heuermann changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to the murders of 7 women: Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Sandra Costilla, Jessica Taylor, and Valerie Mack. Then, without being asked, he admitted to an 8th killing, Karen Vergata, a woman he was never even charged with murdering. His lawyer said later that Heuermann simply reached a point where he told his defense team he wanted to plead guilty, to spare the victims' families a trial, to spare his own family the ordeal of sitting through one. On June 17, 2026, a judge sentenced him to life in prison without any possibility of parole. 3 consecutive life sentences, plus additional decades on top, layered so there's no scenario, no appeal, no reduction, no clerical mistake that ever puts him back on a street again. The judge looked at him and told him exactly what he was: Not the big, quiet architect the neighborhood remembered. A small man, despicable. Whether he counted as a man at all was, in her words, up for debate. Today, Rex Heuermann sits inside Clinton Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in Dannemora, New York, near the Canadian border. As part of his plea agreement, he's required to cooperate with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, sitting for interviews meant to help investigators understand other unsolved serial murders. The man who spent 30 years studying how systems work, how permits get approved, how a structure holds together without collapsing, is now the subject being studied. A few details that never made the news cycle the way they should have. He was in the same graduating class as actor Billy Baldwin, and by most accounts, they barely knew each other. He once gave a deposition where he talked, almost fondly, about the workshop in his basement. The same workshop investigators would later search for evidence. And when detectives finally identified him in 2022, they didn't rush. They spent a full year building a case quietly enough that a man who spent 3 decades planning ahead never saw it coming. Not every name on that stretch of Ocean Parkway has been said yet. An unidentified man in women's clothing, unnamed, remains still waiting on a DNA match that hasn't come through. Somewhere, a family that still doesn't know. Rex Heuermann will die in a cell in upstate New York. That part of the story is finished. The rest of it, how many more there were, how long he really did this, who's still out there without a name, that part isn't closed yet. It may never be.